Once upon a time. Welcome to Australian Book Lovers, your destination for imagination.
A big warm welcome to everyone and a huge thank you for joining us for the Australian Book Lovers podcast for another one of our special editions. Our mission is to bring fabulous Australian and Indigenous literature spanning a whole range of genres to book lovers all across the globe, as well as fantastic resources and information for passionate authors looking to write their next bestseller. I am Darren Kazanko, dystopian science fiction and horror author, reader, and one of your hosts and co-founders of Australian Book Lovers, coming to you today from Kaurna Country in South Australia.
And I'm Veronica Strachan, aka V.E. Patton, fantasy, memoir and picture book writer, reader, and your other co-founder and host, coming to you coming to you again is what I meant to say, from Wurundjeri country over here in Victoria. Now, Darren, this was a pretty exciting panel. Very exciting, stupendous, supernatural and fantastic science fiction panel that we had.
Yes, episode 59, and life got in the way and I couldn't be there
I
to be part
know.
of this panel, and there was so much I wanted to talk about.
Indeed, and not only that, but technology and timing meant that our panel became a very intimate discussion with two brilliant readers. So we had Laurie Bell, who our listeners would have heard before. Laurie, we've talked to about her own science fiction and fantasy series. And so we had Laurie, which was fantastic, and also E.J. Dawson, who again is a multi-genre author, and she's written beautiful space opera as well as gothic horror and lots of different bits and pieces, and another powerhouse writer in the science fiction field. So there is so much in science fiction to talk about, which is why we thought we'd call this panel number 1, and I reckon I can get away with at least 2 or 3 more science fiction panels to talk about climate fiction and dystopian and paranormal and all sorts of different kind of things. So yeah, I had a good time.
Well, I was, listeners, I have to admit, I was tempted, because the year is 2022, and which is a lot later than even Blade Runner's prediction. But anyway, and being science fiction, I thought, I did unfortunately miss out on being able to be part of the recording. And then I thought, maybe with the powers of technology, I would insert myself as an AI version of myself.
Well, you could.
One of those
yes.
like sad robots that
Yes.
was like at the window while it's raining, wanting to come inside. But then I can pretend I'm in part of the conversation, and you just hear me say, "Oh yes, ha 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 ha," like the crazy robot. But you'll be glad to know
like that. Mm-hmm.
I didn't
You
do
didn't.
that.
I'm glad. I'm glad. We had plenty to talk about, yeah. And it having a smaller group was, in fact, a bonus, because it meant that we could sort of dive deeply into all sorts of bits and pieces that, these two writers are such great proponents of their art. It was fantastic to listen to them. I could have listened to them forever. However, it did get pretty late by the time we'd had finished recording. So without further ado, I think we should introduce you to Laurie Bell and E.J. Dawson, our science fiction panel, part 1. Waminyeka. A big warm welcome to everyone, and a huge thank you for joining us for the Australian Book Lovers special podcast. We have a brilliant sci-fi panel tonight, and I have been itching to get these authors on the panel to get talking about sci-fi, and I'm not even going to pretend that I don't love it and that isn't my equal favourite thing to read and write and enjoy. So let's see how we go. And with our timing, that could be quite interesting. So I'm Veronica Strachan, aka V.E. Patton, fantasy, memoir, sci-fi and picture book writer, reader, and one of the co-founders of Australian Book Lovers. And I am your host for this evening, coming to you from Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung country. I have with me two fabulous women tonight. So firstly, I'm going to introduce you with a little bit of a bio to Laurie Bell. Now, Laurie is a writer, a reader, a lover of science fiction and fantasy. So you can see where we get on. This is all good. She lives in Melbourne or Naarm. She was that girl that you found with her nose always buried in a book. She's been writing ever since she picked up her first pen. From novels to short stories, flash fiction and radio plays, snippets of ideas barely formed and acted out loud. She is the author of Whitefire, a science fiction space opera adventure, and a unique collection of short stories set during those events of Whitefire, titled The Good, the Bad and the Undecided. And she's also the author of a YA fantasy series called The Stones of Power via Wyverns Peak Publishing. And that is book 1, The Butterfly Stone, and book 2, The Tiger's Eye. Good evening, Laurie.
Hello, Veronica. I tell you, listening to all of that back, I'm like, goodness, there's a few things there.
There are a few things. You have been around for a little while, and you've got a great set of publishing material there. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, well, I'm also coming to you from Wurundjeri country, and I'm actually on the other side from where you are. So it's quite a wide bit of country, our little space here, if I can get the words out. But no, thank you for inviting me on the panel. I'm really excited to talk all things sci-fi with you tonight.
Excellent. Now, I have got with us as well E.J. Dawson. So E.J. writes sci-fi, fantasy and horror with a dash of the paranormal. Behind the Veil is her first book with literary wanderlust, a romantic suspense with a touch of darkness. And it's very good. I'm sure you've all heard me talk about this one already, as you have heard me talk about Whitefire. So, I've just got to calm the fangirl. It's all right. She also has a fantasy new adult with literary wanderlust, same group, Echo of the Evercry. And she's got 2 self-published series, Queen of Spades and The Last Prophecy series. So a very well established in not only the sci-fi genre, but in fantasy and gothic noir as well. So welcome, EJ.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and thank you for having me on the show again. It's lovely to be here.
Excellent. I just want to say all those superb things like, fantastic and fabulous and amazing and awe-inspiring, all of those things. While you're gathering your thoughts, and the first question I'm going to ask you is why sci-fi, just to get things going, I wanted to share with the listeners a little bit about some of the sci-fi stats that I've discovered in my research there. So some of these are from Alex Newton's K-Lytics report. Now, this is a market snapshot of science fiction and fantasy science fiction, and it only takes in currently Kindle, which is the Amazon kind of ebook market, but they suggest that this is from November 2021, so just late last year. There's a slight downward trend over the last 5 years, but despite this, sci-fi and fantasy are the 4th highest sellers in literature and fiction on Amazon. Now, they still get really strong sales. If your book is in the top 20, up to 394 books a day are being sold. So that's a lot of books, a lot of people out there reading it. If you're in even position 100 on the top sellers, you're still selling about 52 copies a day. So there you go.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's a lot.
That's a lot of copies, isn't it? And position 1 can, in their high points are selling around 4,000 copies. I think you're talking the Frank Herberts and all those kind of bodies up there. That's okay. Interestingly, Kindle Unlimited versus non-ebook, 53% to 47%. So, yeah, we're kind of roughly about the same, although they suggest that ebooks are actually dropping down a little bit since some of the lockdowns have stopped, which is, not surprising. Now, here's one that I'm sure that you will agree with. 81% of the bestseller list in sci-fi is a part of a series. So we love a series in sci-fi. We love bricks that we can read and carry around.
And the next one, and the next one, and the next one.
Trilogy, a trilogy. The average book length is 439 pages. Again, we love a bit of a brick. So there you go. In 2021, November, the biggest category was post-apocalyptic. So that, again, is kind of suits what the mood of the world was doing there.
I think a lot of it... No, I disagree. I would think that a lot of the reason behind having that post-apocalyptic sci-fi was very purposeful. I would think that it was actually there to give purpose. COVID hit us, came out of nowhere, and we were all finding different ways of dealing with it, and many of us didn't. Many of us were very frustrated inside our own homes. We got some of us reached out to get mental health help because we were suddenly facing things we hadn't before. So the idea that there would be a sudden rush to consume post-apocalyptic sci-fi presents to me people finding meaning behind their own isolation and COVID and everything that was going on.
Yes, thinking about that, EJ, I think you're absolutely spot on, because when I think about the endings of the post-apocalyptic stories, they do end more hopeful. We don't have everything blow up and hopefully get consumed by fire. But certainly people coming together, which does tend to be a bit of a with the post-apocalyptic and how do we survive and how do we go forward. And so I suppose that is leading into that hope we can find a way out.
And that then gives a greater value to a sci-fi series, because it's been so long. I mean, one of the things that I've read that's been very interesting about the pandemic has been everyone's interesting take on how people reacted to it since it's kind of calmed down, and how similar it was to the events that transpired after the Spanish flu in the 1920s, in that people actually started to forget about the pandemic. Like, how do you forget?
I know.
But they did. They forgot it. And so there's a lot of interesting psychological studies behind why they chose to do it. And I was talking to someone about this the other day, and it was that nothing memorable is happening to you over this time period. You're not going to weddings, you're not going to birthdays, you're not doing major life events like holidays and things. You are sitting at home. And this brings what I think is a very interesting science fiction concept, if you will, is that this then one of the things that the brain does is that it will not remember minor events. So you notice as you're a child, everything is new and shiny, and there are some certain memories that are quite vivid, like the first time you ever got on a roller coaster, you know, the first time you ever wet your pants at school, whatever the embarrassing experience is, but they're vivid, they're real. There's two things to note here. First, that you don't actually remember the event itself, you remember the last time you remembered it. The second thing is that the brain doesn't actually allow for the storage space to remember what you had for breakfast last Tuesday. And if you're just doing that every single day in and day out, then your brain says, I don't need to remember this stuff. And it doesn't. Which I think in itself is an excellent science fiction story, playing with memory.
Yes.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, to even swing to completely the opposite direction, since there's only women on the panel at the moment, they say something very similar happens with childbirth. If you remembered the pain that you were going through at that time, you wouldn't be doing it again. But a lot of women go back and have a second and a third. So there could also be...
Exactly why I don't have children.
I have to admit, EJ, same.
Well, having had 4 and been a midwife, I would say that, oh my goodness, what the hell am I thinking coming back here again? Yes, our endorphins and our body are very kind to us, because
so we do
otherwise
deal with trauma that way.
There would be some very small populations out there. Now, talking about just the women, I just want to give you just a couple more little things that I think are very relevant, and it was something that EJ and I were speaking about before we began recording. Bookseller reports. So while we had a report from the Americans, now there's a report from the English. Despite their decline in ebook sales, only 80 million instead of 95 million. What a shame.
Gosh.
But so in England, 1 in 5 books bought are ebooks, which is still 630 million Australian dollars, 13% of the overall book market. This is good. But women gained 1% of total ebook purchases in nonfiction, with those over 45 years old increasing their status as the dominant consumer group.
Woohoo!
30% of ebooks overall and 43% of fiction.
Okay, I have a question. It's very immediate, right?
Yep.
What genre, though? This is the real question. What genre?
You fell into my trap very nicely.
I did deliciously, willingly,
Nicely done,
voluntarily. I was Katniss on the pedestal going, I volunteer.
Right. The highest ebook shares: erotic fiction, 61%, romance, 59%, adventure war stories, 50%, crime and thriller, 47%, historical, 44%, and drumroll please, science fiction, 44%.
I'm pretty sure that's all me. I'm pretty sure going through my Kindle. Yeah.
I am definitely doing my damnedest, having just bought today Dead Set Press's latest anthology of Where the Weird Things Are, which is speculative fiction, all the weird and wonderful things in Australia, all Australian stories. So that's fantastic.
I'm looking forward to
So there you go. That's where we are. A quick question then. Let's start with you, EJ. Why science fiction? What is it that you love about science fiction?
So it definitely has to do with the material that I grew up with. So I started fantasy, hardcore fantasy. So I grew up between my mother's romances and my dad's fantasy. But he had Terry Pratchett's. And they also bent themselves, and this is going to sound really strange, and I've never, ever been able to find it. But there was a story about a kind of space detective.
Yeah.
And something to do with women getting pregnant and people stealing the unborn babies and all this other really weird stuff. And I've never been able to find the book, except it honestly sounds a little bit, when I think about my memories of it as an adult, it sounds like it was something that would make me deeply uncomfortable as an adult. But I read it as a teenager and I'm like, okay, this is kind of weird, but very science fiction-y. Yeah. But I think one of the things that always kept up my interest in science fiction was some of the media that I was taking in. So it was a lot of game playing and things like that. One of which was actually Mass Effect. So I always loved Mass Effect. I always loved the idea of space, but also the possibility, because the idea of space is that we're beyond where we are now. And I grew up in an extraordinarily feminist household. I do not know how my father survived, but my mother had 3 daughters and she had views. Wonderful. And the views were relayed with no uncertain terminology. So I grew up with these views. And one of the inspirations behind the series Queen of Spades was when I told them I was self-publishing a a fantasy series that had nothing to do with romance or erotica. He said to me, why don't you just write romance that sells? And oh my God, did you see the fire
smoke
on the side of my face? Heaving breaths. And I probably then wrote a science fiction action story that held an intense respect of the hero towards the heroine. In my science fiction series, Leith, who is the love interest, is consistently respectful of Isla's boundaries. He never, ever, ever just grabs her and kisses her, which is so stereotypical of romance novels. And let's face it, I'm sorry, I like to be grabbed and kissed. But there was this guy who was annoying me and this line I didn't want to cross. So and I made her grab him and kiss him. Nice. And I really like doing that in these stories because it gave a kind of power and sense of control, which the character actually didn't have in her day-to-day life because of the things that was going on in the story. And very much throughout all of it, Leith respects who she is as a woman, which you don't often get in a lot of romance in any case. But the other thing that I really liked about it was that there were no limitations. There was no real sense of gender, like you can't do it because you're a woman. And I think that that's one of the things that we really underestimate the ability of science fiction to do. You can't do it because you're a woman, which fantasy often does the complete opposite of. And fantasy will turn around and say, you did it in spite of being a woman. That's one of the things that I've really, for me, because I like to write strong women, but I like to write, so I'll give you a very good example. In my story, Echo of the Evercry, and in my story, Behind the Veil, the main character is not stereotypically a strong woman. They are strong in their own ways. And I think one of the beautiful things about that is that you get to learn throughout the story exactly what that strength is and what it means for that character. And for me, this is something that I really, really guides me as a writer and why I'm really inspired to write this kind of fiction, because I don't like seeing this sort of, you're a woman, you can't hold a sword, and they're like, yeah, but yes, I can, or even in other genres, you have that stereotypical, you can't because you're a woman. In science fiction, you can assume that we've developed beyond these ideals.
Yes.
And that's what I try to write.
Yes. Excellent.
Yeah.
So, Laurie, come back at me with why you love science fiction.
Well, very similar to EJ there. It's the possibilities. The possibilities are endless with sci-fi. It can go anywhere, anytime. If we're thinking time travel, portal travel can go anywhere across the galaxy, spaceships, and technology enables that equality that you don't get if you're confronted with a giant footballer in a dark alley. I'm immediately going to be put on the defensive. I don't care that they're the loveliest person in the existence of anywhere. I am immediately on the defensive because I'm a tiny little woman, and I immediately think I cannot control this situation if it comes down to a personal power, personal strength. So in sci-fi, you have technology, you have pistols and weapons and things that are designed to be used by anyone. So it doesn't matter if you have disability, it doesn't matter if you have an inability to do things. If you're not strong enough, the technology will compensate for that, where you have technology that will help you lift things and hovercrafts and all sorts of things that you're not restricted in any way, at least in the science fiction that I favor.
Yes.
But also even in that sense of futuristic technology and where things are going, and VR and virtual realities and holograms and all sorts of things, it's very equalizing because there's that anonymity in a virtual reality world, so to speak, where you can be anyone you want to be.
And what I like about the protagonists in both of your sci-fi stories is that regardless of their physical skills, of which they both have some amazing physical skills, it's also their smarts and the combination of their intellect and also the way they manage relationships. Some better than others. Layla works through hers as she gets through the trilogy. But it is about more than just that kind of response stuff that sometimes you get. And, EJ and I are both judges in the self-published science fiction competition at the moment.
Oh, wow.
And read an absolutely amazing array of books. But I now know what I really like and what I don't want to read anymore again.
Yeah,
what the ones that
it's
really
a bit like
get
that.
me,
I have to confess.
Yes,
I'm over it.
that really engage me instantly are the ones where the person, and I've admitted this in some of my scoring. For me, it's about the social connection. And if I like the people, if I understand what's driving them or depressing them or putting them down or bringing them up, and if they're making the effort to be understanding of themselves and other people in that setting, then they're far more likely to get me turning the page than if they just shoot people and ask questions later kind of thing. It's like, okay, we've seen a lot of that, give me something different.
Yes, like in White Fire with my hero Tony, she has some very obvious limitations in how she perceives her appearance and how her eyes don't function very well, so she has to have special digital glasses, and she has a robot dog that basically acts as her assistant. That robot dog. And I love Mate, and he's my favorite character. But it's Tony's journey, and she does deal with this relationship that doesn't work out. And what I like in my sci-fi, and my grandma might not agree with me because she'd prefer romance to be in everything, but I find that the romance is secondary in sci-fi. It's the driver is how the person's dealing with their emotional journey and where they're at in their life and where they're growing and what they're becoming. And in Tony's case, she has to deal with the smuggler, Dan, who just gets in her way most of the time. But she does fall for him. And it's that first breakup that a person goes through and how they deal with coming out the other side of that and being independent and being able to cope on your own and be even better than you were before.
Yeah.
So I find that journey, and so in a way, Dan's kind of there as just set dressing, he's moving Tony's story along.
Yep.
And I find that's where I get the most out of Tony.
Yeah.
Mm.
Can we just take this feminist thread just a little bit further? Now, I've got a kind of a longish quote that I want to say, and, listeners, I've sent these quotes to people so they can have a little think about it. But it was one that I thought was particularly thought-provoking. Quote begins, "Feminist science fiction is a subgenre of science fiction focused on theories that include feminist themes, including but not limited to gender inequality, sexuality, race, economics, and reproduction. Feminist SF is political because of its tendency to critique the dominant culture. Some of the most notable feminist science fiction works have illustrated these themes using utopias to explore a society in which gender differences or gender power imbalances do not exist, or dystopias to explore worlds in which gender inequalities are intensified, thus asserting a need for feminist work to continue. Science fiction and fantasy serve as important vehicles for feminist thought, particularly as bridges between theory and practice. No other genres so actively invite representations of the ultimate goals of feminism, worlds free of sexism, worlds in which women's contributions to science are recognised and valued, and worlds that explore the diversity of women's desire and sexuality, and worlds that move beyond gender." And that was by Elise Ray Halford. So I think that kind of sums up but draws out what you were both telling me about the things that are important to you to put into stories. So what are your thoughts on that? Very long, but for me, and given that we've just, in Australia, we've just had an election where I think we've just about doubled the number of women representatives in Australia, and really the quiet Australian that an ex-Prime Minister thought was going to put him back in, those quiet Australians turned out to be not the blokes, but in fact the women of Australia, and many of them voted for independence and many of them voted against those traditional parties. So have I messed up the quote now that I've gone into politics? But anyway,
No.
let's go, EJ.
Not at all, because it is a political discussion. It is absolutely a political discussion. And science fiction enables you to take this in several different ways. So you can write your stereotypical strong female who doesn't need a man, or even characters who are perceived as weaker, having the technological advancements so that they don't need the assistance of a man to carry a heavy gun or whatever it happens to be. Or you can go in the other direction where the gender divide becomes greater and you have those incredible patriarchies, and you have your Margaret Atwoods and all of that. One of the stories that I read in the last couple of years was actually a book by Ann Tibbetts called Screams from the Void, which is an interesting take on abuse towards a woman. And I mean in a very toxic relationship kind of thing, which runs undercurrent of an almost alien-like story. So if you like Alien, you'll love this book. But one of the things that I really liked about it was its take that even like the thing is that those people in this world still exist, and it brings about an interesting way about the way we think about women, not just in science fiction, but how they'll be viewed in future. Because let's face it, a lot of these opinions about women and their ability to control certain environments hasn't actually changed. Yes, there are certain circumstances where women in the past have been quite powerful, but very much behind the scenes. And a part of me wonders if that will ever change. So the idea that we can have this interesting perspective of women and the difference that they could make in society, and all the, how do I phrase this, the different possibilities that you could play with gender as a role in science fiction remains to me somewhat up for skepticism, because things haven't changed a lot. Will they change in future? I would like to hope so. I don't know that that would be something that would actually happen.
Laurie, what about you?
It's interesting. It's not just the science fiction topic itself. It's women writing science fiction too, and female writers. There's such an interesting, and I get this daily. The spelling and pronunciation of my name is it's Laurie, which is an American pronunciation. In Australia, the spelling of my name is more common with men.
Yep.
It's a more masculine spelling of my name. And I have used it myself in using that as my name on my books in Australia without a author photo on the back of the book, because there is still an incredibly strong bias, and it is getting better, but there is an incredibly strong bias where some, not all, some men will pick up a book by a male writer before they'll even go anywhere near a female writer. And especially in, say, your male dominated topics, which drives me crazy. I'm trying not to swear very, very hard there, where it just drives me crazy. Because there are some amazing women Western writers and military authors, and it's not just sci-fi. It's in anything that's considered male-dominated areas.
Yeah,
and it's the same with books. And you'll see all the books face out that are male writers.
And that's actually something that's been very distressingly relayed to me in the traditional publishing sphere, which is that there is no room for science fiction females. And it doesn't actually matter if they're writing the same thing. There's not a space for them. And the idea that there is not a space for female science fiction writers is incredibly upsetting when we're writing almost the same thing.
Yes.
Like, I mean, for example, Queen of Spades is about an assassin who's frozen in time by her ex-lover, and spoiler alert, just in case you haven't read it. And
just go la 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 la, listeners, if you don't want to hear what happens to Ayla, because it's a really good series. But anyway, go on.
But it's quite distressing to think that there's a lot of the if you look at the British Science Fiction Awards, you look at a lot of awards that's given out for science fiction. What is wonderful though, what is really nice to see changing is the amount of science fiction writing that is not by white men. So to give a really wonderful example, the Nebulas were last weekend from memory, and I'm going to preface this by saying I do not know how to pronounce his name, and that is my personal fault. But Ogunchavi Ekpeki was the Nebula Award winner for his science fiction book in this year's the Nebula Awards. I just think that's absolutely lovely, because one of the growing trends that I have personally tried to support has been the decolonization of space.
Yeah.
Because there is definitely a preference for space, and space, when you think about space as a genre, you tend to go in two different directions. You tend to go in your Star Wars, already established space opera, established civilizations, or you're moving in a space exploration kind of way, which has so many deeply racial colonist vibes. Like it's horrifying when you take a step back and you look at it from somebody whose country was invaded by the British and various others. It's quite horrifying the way we think about science fiction, because it's supposed to be the future. So there's some absolutely beautiful science fiction that is being written by authors, BIPOC authors, and authors of color. Like for a perfect example, and I do not mean to spoil it at all, but Iron Widow.
Best book ever. Love it.
Iron Widow by Zara J is just wonderful. It is very surprisingly, it will catch you. Science fiction element will very much catch you off guard, and that's all I'm going to say about it for spoiler alerts. So there's definitely a lot of really wonderful science fiction that is rising to the surface, because we are starting to do what we needed to have done to a lot of these genres, which is decolonize them.
And a perfect example is Claire G. Coleman's two books that I've read of hers, which are just absolutely brilliant. So Claire is Warloman Noongar, Australian writer and poet, and her debut novel, Terra Nullius, won the Norma K. Hemming Award. It was just brilliant, and absolutely no spoilers there. You must read it. I did a workshop with Claire and it was like, this woman needs to just write full time, which I believe she's doing now, which is fantastic.
Wonderful.
And then her second book, The Old Lie, was equally as compelling. And it was from that colonised view, being an Indigenous Australian, and it was just, but set in space. And it was like the whole thing was just so connected back to country and connected out in the universe. It was brilliant. So yeah, it put all those fabulous.
I think that's
people
why I
out
love
there.
sci-fi so much. It puts it in a futuristic, perhaps, way, but it is talking about now and our past and our current situation in a way that really brings it to the forefront.
Yeah.
And you see that like anyone who says that all writing is not political, I just jump up and down and pull my hair out.
So yeah, you haven't read any sci-fi lately, have you?
Oh my gosh. Or any sci-fi ever in the history of anything, and fantasy as well, and romance and everything. Every bit of writing is political. But
I think that's also the drive for a lot of a lot for the genre. When you think about the genre, it would be rude at this point in time to eliminate what the erotic genre has done for science fiction. And I'm very distressed to find that a lot of erotica for science fiction, it tends to be the alien tentacle thing. We're not going to avoid it, so I may as well just throw that one out there for everyone who doesn't know.
Tentacle fish.
And I, different strokes for different folks, and I'm not even going to ask how many strokes are involved.
No.
But the point is that for a lot of romance, science fiction, a lot of the alien visitations, all of that sort of stuff, what you have to look at as a genre is that it's the opportunity for people of all different kinds to go against a grain, because it represents a future of rights. It represents a future where we have the capability. More importantly, it's not even in question. And it's not just about BIPOC rights. It's about LGBTQ rights. It's about the ability to be yourself without judgment, which we get closer and closer to. And this is 2022. We shouldn't be having these issues. You shouldn't be having people trying to tell women what to do with their bodies, which is a whole other topic. But the point is that we as a society, as stringent and as strained as it is, do evolve. And the idea is a hope that with this evolution comes the opportunity for freedom without judgment. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about sci-fi, but I also think it's one of those things that the publishing industry is very negligent to take on board, because quite often they will want what you want in a lot of stories, which is conflict. And the idea that you could be somebody, your true self, so BIPOC, LGBTQ, people who without judgment in a science fiction world, whereas they're relying on the conflict being around who you currently are. So they see more of that in a contemporary environment as opposed to science fiction. And I think that's one of the most damaging things about science fiction. I'll give a really good example of where I want to really reiterate this, which is, so as some people will be aware, I know Veronica certainly is, I'm autistic. And one of the two books that I would have loved to see a greater public reception to is The Outside by Ada Hoffman, where it has a main character who's autistic, and Nifok Gloss by Essa Hansen. And one of the things that I think that science fiction, like the greater public, is that they're more interested in listening to the trauma of these voices than they are listening to their hopeful stories going through the ordinary adventures of what most ordinary neurotypical straight white male actors or characters have in these roles. And I look forward to a science fiction future where we can experience a greater diversity of these characters experiencing adventures and trauma that do not revolve around their identities.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, can I just one last bit to comment on? And I've seen this in many Twitter threads of late, and popping up quite a lot in the last year and the last 2 years, is that there is whether it's a publishing bias, whether it's a bookseller bias, whether it's a reader bias, and it could very well be all three. It could be that one leads the other, which leads the other, but that there is a view that women cannot write adult science fiction, that female writers are only writing YA science fiction, and if it's written by a woman, it must be YA, and it's put in the YA shelf. And it's happening more and more and more. And even some of the really big names of fantasy as well as science fiction are having this complaint where they're talking about their books being, this is absolutely not suitable for children. It's absolutely not suitable for young adults. It is an adult book. There are adult themes, but they're being shelved where children can buy them because they're seen as, oh, well, a woman's written that, must be YA. And that drives me crazy because books are very specifically marketed as adult or YA. And if it's put in as adult, don't shelve it in the YA area, regardless of who the author is.
The other thing that it's really doing is it's trivializing those voices.
Yes,
it is underaging those voices. Purposefully, to my mind. There's quite a lot of angry young woman fiction that's put in young adult that really needs a more adult audience, because we are still trying to dismantle the concept of, well, be an adult, well, stop being such a little girl. And that for me is one of the most offensive parts about this whole idea of women in science fiction. It's that, and you can sit there and you can tell me until you're blue in the face, there are heaps of science fiction women out there. And I just want to say that I have a list of them. It's a pretty short list.
Yeah, can I just add into there that not everybody has to be coming of age? No. That, you know.
No.
There are old people that could be driving starships.
Well, let me just say, and I'm not sure if this song will win, but I reckon it's fabulous. It's got to the finals. Captain Wu, Starship Nameless #1, written by Patrice Fitzgerald, and who I think she's either Canadian or American, and Jack Lister, who's an Australian author. The captain is 61. Oh, yes!
Is that on our SPSFC list?
That is on our finals list. And I started reading that and I thought, oh, I think I love it already.
Yeah, but and that's the thing.
It's there.
Not that we're giving away who's going to win that award.
No, we have very little say, actually, because, sadly, I think all of the ones that we had, none of them made it into the final, which was like, really? Anyway, we'll see how we go. I haven't read all of them.
But you're absolutely spot on.
Yeah.
It's there are middle-aged sci-fi fans as well as middle-aged sci-fi captains and superheroes, and like. You don't
world
have
is
to
not
be
under 18, or 18 to 26. There are more of them out there, and I think that just, it does tend to be not only sexist but ageist as well.
Let's take this back for a moment and think about the way that we publicly consume science fiction. And when we publicly consume it, when we're talking about a greater market, what we're talking about is where its genre falls, what comes into the public mind. And you have two things for science fiction: Star Wars and Star Trek. And then you fall into the same basic principles that we fall into storytelling, which is epic, already established, empire, a bad guy, good guys, clearly established. It's magic in space with a good side and a bad side. And then you have Star Trek, which is the colonization thing all over again. And so the idea of, for me, for fantasy and science fiction and the way it differs from other genres is that because a lot of other genres come with this pre-expectation of what the story is going to be, whereas fantasy and science fiction really allows you to explore different kinds of storytelling and different kinds. You can definitely have a crime in space. You can definitely have a murder mystery in a fantasy. But when you have romance, you're getting a happily ever after. When you get a detective story, you know that you're going to get a murder mystery with the detective solving who did it in the end or near enough too. And I think one of the things about the way that we think about science fiction and fantasies, it relies too much on these stereotypes already established in a public consuming genre of Star Wars and Star Trek to enable other avenues to even get popular.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I'm a big fan of both, but they're continually remaking them. Whereas, I'm still dying for N.K. Jemison's movies. They're being written, and she's writing.
I'm about to make you both
so
very, very happy.
Excited.
Go on then. Tell us. What have you got for us?
If you have never watched it, I recommend that you do. There are two science fiction series that one I strongly recommend over the other. I will state the one I recommend less. And this is one of the things that actually got me finishing the Queen of Spades series. It's called Dark Matter.
Love it.
Yeah.
Available on the Sci Fi Panel.
Love number 2. Sorry.
But it's a great science fiction series, and it's got those really interesting female-based stories, but it's more crew-based, it's more group-based, which I think is really interesting because, once again, the way we think about stories and the actual arc of stories tends to fall into a certain predetermined framework. And when you look beyond that framework, if you start trying to find ways to push that, if you don't push it the right way, the audience isn't going to like it. Yeah. One of the things the other series that I really, really loved was Killjoys.
Yes.
Oh, I haven't seen that one.
Oh, that's so good.
If you have not watched Killjoys, to my mind, it is the best science fiction story ever done, and it has the ultimate season ending. You will not get a more perfect season ending than we got with Killjoys. The writers, I would personally buy the writers drinks for the rest of their life. Like, I don't know how to thank the writers for the ending of that series enough, because it was perfect. You know how with a lot of season endings, things are rushed and it feels like there's a lot going on and you're not capturing it all and you're wondering if it's going to all turn out the way that you want. Killjoys just brings all these elements into play and all this beautiful acting and really cements it home. And one of the things that I like about it most is that the main character is a woman, and the fact that she's a woman as a main character doesn't have a lot of impact on the story.
Yeah.
Let's take it in a slightly different direction now and think about all of the subgenres that belong in sci-fi. And I know, Laurie, you've got some definitions of sci-fi because we had a bit of a quick chat about that. And look, some of the early ones from, the early greats like Isaac Asimov saying science fiction defined as that branch of literature which deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. And look, that may certainly have been where it began. But have you got something for me that perhaps is a little more current?
Ooh, more current.
Yeah, the 1975
list. I had quite a few actually, and I was having to whittle them down because
everyone has an opinion.
So excited. well, that's right, absolutely.
I just think for listeners who are while you keep looking for listeners who are not science fiction fanatics, here are some of the first of all, the difference between sci-fi and fantasy, because they're under this kind of group umbrella of speculative fiction. But in 1962, Rod Serling said, fantasy is the impossible made probable, but science fiction is the improbable made possible. And I thought, well, really, that's probably as good a, definition as any.
Actually, there's a very interesting topic when it comes to publishing when you're identifying genre. Yep. And I don't necessarily agree with it, but I have been informed that it is true. And that is that you cannot have magic in space. And the reason why is because science is there to explain it. So you're left with this interesting predilection because you've got to be able to, and this is the thing, and this brings me on to a very weird subject, but bear with me.
Yeah, she's going the broad and bringing us back to the specific.
I am, as I do, as you well know I do.
Yeah.
So one of the things about science fiction is you've got to explain it. You've got to make it make sense, as opposed to with, I guess, some softer science fiction like steampunk, where you can say it's the ether, it's powered by the ether. The ether has powered this.
Yes.
And see, one thing that I find with that is, of course, as Arthur C. Clarke said once upon a time, too long ago, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Yes. So that doesn't mean that
that's one of my favorite sayings.
Yes. Terry Pratchett actually I'm going to go in a different direction.
Go.
Terry Pratchett actually phrases very interesting in his Tiffany A. King series, where he said it's magic, it's just because you understand how it works doesn't stop it being magical.
Yes, precisely.
And this
I love
is the thing, and this is absolutely the thing. You can have this really interesting idea of what it is to have science fiction, as opposed to fantasy and not having magic in space and everything, which I disagree with, because the first place where you have magic in space is Star Wars, which is one of our taboo established science fiction like props. It props up so much of the genre. It's not funny. And one of the things that I find really challenging about then writing science fiction is then coming up with the explanations for things like interstellar travel. Like, I don't know about you, Laurie, but I found that a little bit difficult. And it's because, and this is where I went on my little segue, sorry. So one of the most successful self-published novelists of our times, and some of you will instantly know what I'm talking about, some of you won't, was a science fiction writer who wrote a movie that featured Matt Damon called The Martian.
Yes.
But I recently discovered this, and this is something to do with the talk I was doing elsewhere, but I recently discovered that part of the reason he was so successful was because he actually, I forget his exact title, it is something rather official, but it basically establishes that he is quite a technological expert. And he actually got people reading his work through his website because he was so technologically specific, because he was aware of the technology. So he didn't have to just make stuff up that would do for the average everyday author. He made up stuff that would make sense to aerophysicists or whatever the hell, you know. He had stuff that made sense to people who were intimately knowledgeable about technology in space and the way that it actually works. And that was part of the reason that he actually became so successful, was because he already had a reader base of 30,000 by the time he stopped publishing on his website and started actually producing a book. That was a long train ride.
Oh no, I'm just letting it sink in and get myself a little bit organised now.
Okay, so I found a couple of my quotes, which of course by the wonderful Terry Pratchett. Evil begins when you begin to treat people as things.
Granny Weatherwax. And that trivia, I would win.
And that one speaks to me from a sci-fi point of view, because a lot of the times sci-fi will bring out that sense of the other, or talk about the aliens and as things, and where does humanity go when they're confronted with that, whether it's for good or evil, and it could go either way. But it shows you that talking about the other through aliens and making the commentary on how we behave now and what we would be likely to do in such an event.
But that then touches on our colonistic views as well, because the way that we treat other species is inherently, and Terry Pratchett does an interesting thing in his work, because he's not science fiction, obviously he's fantasy. However, the way that he handles racism is that, and I am butchering this particular quote, is that humans don't care about the color of each other's skin while they can sit there and look down on dwarves and hate trolls. And I think that that's a very interesting take on the way that we treat alien species in science fiction. One of the novels that I was very interested to see the way that they actually treat aliens. Obviously, you've got your Star Trek, a lot of the different ways that they handle the alien subject. But I really, really like the way that Amy Kaufman and
Jay Christoph
did it in their science fiction series Aurora Rising. Which was just a different part of the crew, but I found that the dynamics between the characters was made much more interesting by their perspective, but also about the way that their characters were laid out. And the other author that does this really, really well was Gareth Powell. So if you haven't, I love Gareth Powell. I'm not even going to lie about this. If you have never read Gareth Powell and you really hate prologues, you hate prologues.
I don't hate prologues, so that's all right. I'm in.
But if you did, he would absolutely convert you. And the reason why is because he writes a series called Embers of War. And he does, if you've read it, it will never leave you. And it's got a lot of those old World War vibes to it. But the opening prologue has this wonderful scene that really uses a lot of excellent storytelling tools to greater convey how terrible war is. But one of the things that, I'm getting slightly off track, I love that series. One of the things that I really love about it is how he portrays certain things. First and foremost being an alien species and the way it thinks, which is quite succinct, which was interesting to me because Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff did the same thing. When they had their alien series, the way that the aliens thought was different. And then it takes a whole other turn when you start thinking about other kind of voices that we can't necessarily predict, like artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Slight segue here.
Mm-hmm.
Brian Aldiss described science fiction as cultural wallpaper, saying that the evidence for this, the widespread influence, can be found in trends for writers to employ science fiction as a tool for advocacy and generating cultural insights, which we've kind of done a little bit of, but as well as for education when teaching across a range of academic disciplines, not limited to the natural sciences. So my question to you is, Laurie, let's start with you. Are you advocating for someone or something in your writing?
Always.
Always.
Whether I know that I am or not, I don't know. But certainly a lot of my flash fiction and a lot of my short stories, and that reminds me I need to do my 100 words today. A lot of my flash fiction tends to involve aliens attacking Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And really bringing in a concept of, quite often, aliens visiting Earth as tourists, seeing Earth, whether it's at a destructed point of view or whether it's as in a hidden sense that they're hiding amongst us, so to speak, and what their view on humans are. And I find that to me is really interesting, and I always find the most realistic of science fiction is that it's casting that mirror on us and who we are and what we are and what we do and what our instinctive mannerisms are, as opposed to when we're under attack, as opposed to when we're in a good place and exploring. And it's very much well, what would someone else think of us coming here and seeing what's going on? Right down to, walking into a McDonald's or, or turning on the TV and watching the TV. Like, what would they be thinking?
So are you advocating for a better...
I think I'm advocating more to understand ourselves.
Yeah. To really build our emotional intelligence, dare I say it, so that we can do a little bit of self-reflection and see where the world's at. Because, look, compassion is, I just wish that we had a little more compassion.
Empathy.
Yeah.
That would be great.
We can move on to all those things. All right, excellent. So thanks, Laurie. EJ, what about you? Who are you advocating for, or what in your writing?
Oh, often I have a lot of characters who are quite selfish. I'm not even going to lie about that. So
doesn't mean that you're not advocating for something.
I think that a lot of the times with science fiction, I'm actively fighting against a higher moralistic goal, because I don't think that there's often in a lot of fiction the idea of it's the world, like the world is at stake. And I think that a lot of the time we need to bring that down a little bit, because the world is so often used as the stakes, that it's a tried and tested trope, and that we need to make it more personal in a lot of ways. And part of my reason for that is because when you're thinking about a reader and what they want to get out of your story, often it's actually not a moral lesson. They're not actually reading it because they want to be educated on how they can be a better person. They might want to hope for a better future, but really, like, you're reading it for the action, you're reading it for the distraction, you're reading it for the sexy scenes, you're reading it because the world is a pretty freaking awful place. And often you're reading because you want to bring meaning to the awfulness in your own life. If you're reading anything that's awful, like a lot of readers will quite happily sit there and say, no, I'm only reading happy stuff. I want triggers in the start of all my novels because I only want to be happy. And you know what? Yep. I want an escape. That's exactly right. They want to not be here. And I think that the author needs to really keep that in mind. So if I have a moral lesson in my story, it is secondary to the character's agency, because at the end of the day, we don't do things based on the moral lesson of our lives. We do things based on the way we feel. And I think it's really important, because the way that we feel and the way that we relay those feelings to the readers is what makes them enjoy our work.
Yeah.
Yes. And actually, sorry, I just wanted to be really
give it to
the
me.
other thing I advocate is family with sci-fi. You know, every superhero, it's all about the orphan. It's all about the how they've all died and there's no family. And I'm sorry, but all of my sci-fi, I've got family. They have got family problems. Everyone has got family.
Can I tell you something though?
Mother issues. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm gonna pop that particular bubble rather harshly. I'm actually doing a course, a graduate certificate in creative writing, and I was very shocked to learn this, but I found it very fascinating. Do you know why a lot of the time in any story, regardless of genre, you will often have the orphan? Because it removes the responsibility of your actions.
Yep.
You don't have somebody there saying, no, don't do it because. And I think that a lot of the times that it helps create conflict, but there's no guidance, there's no you shouldn't. There's not a lot of the barriers that we would otherwise see on the character's decision making to say to them, that's a really dumb idea. You shouldn't do that. Fine, you're going to do it. I'm going to sit back and laugh while you do it. You know, you don't have that adult authority in the life. And if you do, they are often used as a sacrifice 30 to 50% of the way through a book, or even at 70% of the book, as a moral lesson to death. Yep. So one of the things I often find about the idea of found family that is really interesting is because it represents that more of a, when your family doesn't accept you, you can find somebody else. But the whole purpose of having no parents represents no barriers to the wounds that life can inflict on you.
I like a bit of a family connection, I must admit, Laurie, because sometimes when I'm reading fantasy, I think, oh, here's another orphan. Where are all these parents? What are they doing?
Yep.
And there are ways, and perhaps that's why, and I'm sure some of it is my age, because my baby is 25. My oldest is 30-something. She'll kill me if I can't remember, but I can't remember exactly what it is. But anyway, having seen them grow through their coming of age, having seen friends' children and, you know, their nieces and nephews and all those things, I'm a bit over coming of age and teenagers doing dumbass things, let's be honest.
Not having any guidance.
And for so many, yes, that is absolutely the way of the world, and parents are not universally good, let's be honest. And some of their influence is incredibly hard to, you know, to really shake off. But I think that for me, reading is about 3 E's. I either want to be entertained, educated, or I want to escape. So sometimes the book is all three, and I find, I'm reading something that, gee, I didn't know that. That's really, you know, I love the way this writer is writing, and there's a whole different world that I'm going to. So if I have all three of those, then that's brilliant. But,
and, you know, you have characters, if they're older characters, which is why there needs to be more older characters.
Yes.
They've got different family issues. You have children issues. You have you have parent issues who are going through, say, dementia or you know, having to become the parent to your parent, and there's so many areas that can be explored with that. And that's why with a lot of my sci-fi, I make sure there's family there because we've all got issues.
But the thing about a lot of those genres is people want them in a setting they understand.
Yeah.
So the idea of putting them in space it makes it harder for an audience who is more interested in that kind of drama to relate to, because for a lot of readers, and this is no slight on readers, but a lot of people really do struggle to imagine those kinds of futures without an established building block. That's part of the problem with science fiction fantasy, is that we are talking about fantastical worlds. We are talking about far-flung futures, and often we have to put them in settings or placements that make sense to readers. And I absolutely believe in having more, you know, older women and older men and older non-binary people in spaces where we're exploring the trauma within families. But quite often people want that in a relatable setting. They want it in a contemporary setting, which I think is a detriment to the possibility of what you could do with stories.
With sci-fi. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that filters my enjoyment of reading is, I'm sure, being a coach and doing leadership coaching and working often with, you know, sort of middle to senior people who are kind of in their career at that point where, because they don't take up their authority, responsibility, accountability, whatever you like to say, that's what I'm there for, to make them do it. Not to make them do it, but to say it's not that hard and here's ways you can do it. Look at the strengths that you have and all of those kind of things. Yep. So I feel frustrated when there's kind of that irresponsible teenager stuff happens, and I feel like saying, I could just shake you.
Yeah.
But quite often that's absolutely, like, you have the orphan figure there to create conflict, to create no guidance.
Yes. And when I can shake them, then it's a good story because obviously they've upset me and they've challenged my thinking. Yes.
Yeah, but it does, and you, to an absolutely large extent, you are right. It gets a little tiring. Like, there is an essence there of that idea of this young adult not knowing their own way. It becomes tiring. It becomes very much less of a sense of a discovery and more a case of, stop being so stupid. Come on, you can't possibly be this stupid. But the trouble is that a lot of these stories are so centered on imagined futures and possibilities that have yet to be discovered that an older audience isn't going to associate with them as much because they've already seen the future and what they were told the future was going to be. Which is why a younger audience is going to have more appreciation for possibility because they don't have, well, I was told there was going to be flying cars in 2020 and you don't have them.
Not.
And I'm an
Where's my hoverboard?
Where is my damn I watch Back to the Future, okay? And I have not got what I paid for.
There you go.
And they do say that from a sci-fi point of view, it's almost impossible to write completely unknown technology.
Yes.
But that's the thing. Technology is generally known.
Yeah, because we've caught up to it. But way back when, they were coming up with, you know, a way of communicating with pressing a badge on your chest. Oh, well, your mobile phone basically does that for you now. So that sort of thing, it's if you look at where technology is heading, what are those sci-fi stories being? So even imagining, you know, people with chips in their heads, well, they're doing it now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think of the heart things that we've got. So let me ask you then, do you bring your own understanding of science or mechanics or climate knowledge to your writing, or do you think your writing has helped shift your concept of the future of our world? Laurie, let's start with you.
I only laugh. I laughed at the beginning of that because I actually have a friend who's a doctor of astrophysics.
Right. Excellent.
And
Excellent.
no,
because
I think she looks down on me and says, "You can't do that. You don't do it that way. That's not real." So I'm sure that there is. I definitely don't. I try to put a little bit of science in. I've got a number of books that I use as reference material and documentaries that I've watched on streaming services and reading New Scientist magazine and all those sorts of things to try and bring a bit more realism into it. But I am a fiction writer. I am making stuff up.
You're making stuff up.
I am
because
making stuff
science fiction readers can be really nasty if it comes to the science and it's not at least partly believable.
Yes. so
you do feel like saying you realise this is just a story, you know, but
But this is the idea where magic comes into play. In fantasy, you can explain away magic. Explain away what
that's how they do it.
In science, you have to prove it. Science is factual.
Yeah. So, EJ, what about for you? Your understanding of science or mechanics or climate change or politics, whatever that might be. What do you think? Has that helped shift your concept of the future of our world?
Absolutely. And I've done the research to prove it. So I did quite a lot of research into the way that hypertravel worked to come up with the concept of to travel across vast distances of space for my Queen with Spades series. And I use magnets. mostly because for me, they represent an element of the unknown capability of magnetic power.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely think that I kind of winged that one completely, but it represented to me something that I could play with and make it believable enough. And I think that's the thing about science fiction. Provided that you have laid the groundwork for believability, it's okay. So in fantasy, you have, well, it's magical, but magical still requires certain balancing aspects. This is actually for a different panel, but it definitely
I won't say if you don't.
Yeah.
Don't tell on me. Don't tell on me. There's definitely an element of balance between the elements when you think about fantasy magic. And while there can be other elements in magic, it comes with like earth, fire, water, air. And then you have light and dark, and you can have absolutely other elements, but they balance out. In science fiction, you really need to be able to prove what it is that you're trying to do, and quite often we don't have the technological wording in order to do that, or we're dealing with work that has yet to be scientifically proved. But more importantly, I mean, I don't know about Laurie here, but I'm not an astrophysicist. I don't know space.
I don't know any.
Yeah, so there's an element of making it up to its believable levels, but obviously there's enough research goes into it so that you can convey to the average pleb that, hey, this makes sense on a spacey level. And they will say, you know what, I'll buy it just because I want to get on with the story. And this is the real thing about it. You can have your technological experts to sit there and go, well, you can't do it because of this and X and Y and Z and rah, rah, rah. And if that doesn't please them, that's fine. But for the average person who enjoys science fiction, and this is the thing that really bugs me about science fiction, the idea that the science takes away from the fun of science fiction really has a huge detriment on the genre, because we spend so much time worrying about making it factual, we forget the story.
Lose the story.
Yeah.
You
know, EJ, let's keep going with you for a minute. In terms of how deep and broad you take your world building, and you've said you do some research and that kind of thing, how much, can you sort of hazard a guess at what kind of percentage of your book composes, that kind of technical, scientific, the actual science fiction nuggets?
Easily 30%.
30%, yeah.
Yep, and we'll actually break that down into 3 specific icons. So the first one was chronological freezing, and the way that affects the brain and whatnot, and the inherent memory loss that could be possible with being cryogenically frozen. And for the main character in the science fiction series that I was writing, it's infinitely possible, because the brain is effectively, if you shut down the brain for too long, it will die.
Yes.
So the idea of being cryogenically frozen means the brain effectively still has to be kept in some element alive, which then tampers with all of the functions that the brain has. And then quite often, a lot of the way that tampering represents itself is in memory. All right, you don't actually, you drink a lot, you bang your head, whatever it happens to be. Our brains, when we think about it, are actually quite sensitive. And a lot of the ways they represent that sensitivity is in memory. And part of that is that the body's natural ability to shut down, to go, no, that is too painful or too traumatic, I'm blocking that out. So that was one of the elements that I was really playing with on my story. The second element I was playing with was space travel, because the idea of faster than light travel and whatnot and all that seems very much like a magic in space kind of claim, which wasn't enough for me. So years and years ago, I came up with a story called Dump, and it was
Great title.
No, okay. For all of you being
don't get sidetracked.
Yeah, sorry.
All right, just ruin this. Basically, okay. Stop being disgusting. You stupid Australians. Basically, it was about the idea that across the galaxy were these, I'm not going to help myself here, bear with me. There were these rings in space, and they were basically the ability to create an electric magnetic field, right? That could, the draw and attraction of them helped enable ships to travel from one realm to another by being drawn through that magnetic field. Mm-hmm. But obviously, a magnetic field can draw more than the elements it was intended. Yes?
Yes.
Right. So then it became more about what it was that the magnetic field was drawing into itself. Mm-hmm. And so then you had an element of what would the excess was. But then what would happen to that excess? What would realistically happen to having like a magnetic field in space? Other things would come to it. And so it began as...
So Laurie, I think she wanted us to answer there, but I was hoping it was a rhetorical question. Really late.
I'm like, oh no, it's too late. I can't science.
She's going to dive into it. I'm sure she'll help us out. She will.
No, I am. Because the idea was that there was this young boy on one of these rings, and basically he started to be able to sense when too much build-up happened outside the electromagnetic field that would actually cause a shutdown in the ring itself, right?
Yep.
So and his ability to predict them meant he had psychic powers, and that was where the story was. And I used that same idea in Queen of Spades to represent across space travel, because the first thing you learn about space is that it's a long bloody way.
It's really big. It is really big.
That's one of the hardest things to nail about science fiction writing is how do you deal with the fact that it's a long bloody way? And, this is a bunch of Australians sitting here saying this to God knows who.
Yeah, everything's a bloody long way.
You have Americans say it's right around the corner, it takes them 5 minutes, and we're like, it's right around the corner. And
it's 4 hours.
Like, it's a long bloody way.
Third element. Give us your third one.
So that was the third element. Oh gosh, now you've caught me. So that was the now I have to think back. I'm too busy thinking space is really big. Nanobots.
Nanobots.
So the third thing that I really did a lot of research in was to nanobots. And the limitless potential of nanobots almost lends itself to the magical in their ability to repair cells, enhance cells, give us a greater sense of control over the world. And I definitely went to town, and I have absolutely no problems admitting this. I went to town using magical ability in nanotechnology to create the kind of situations that I wanted to. And I think that that's the one of the things that we often forget about technology, that it is a kind of magical.
Can I say that in both of your books, and Laurie, I haven't got to you on your proportions and that kind of thing at the moment, but there was enough of technology and science and obviously well researched, this is how the world fits together, for me to go, oh yeah, okay, we're there. But not enough that I was like, oh, please don't tell me how every single pulsar star, and I don't want to know what this switch does and that one does, and to this where I'm skipping pages and going, I hope I haven't missed anything really good, because that was like 4 pages of description of the Atom Drive.
You got to remember, who are you writing for?
Yes.
At the end of the day, who are you writing for?
Yeah.
And this is the thing that changes how much science fiction you write. So the guy who wrote The Martian, who became so successful.
Yes.
Andy Weir.
Yes, Andy Weir. Yep.
When they made the movie, they actually got people from NASA to come in and make sure that what they were doing was correct.
That's pretty good. The book was a little different from the movie, let's just say that, no spoilers. But I did quite like, he had a bit of a technical background, and that's probably as much as I would like, was what Andy Weir put in. Laurie, let's have a look at your book, the series, which is going to be the series.
Yes.
Whitefire. How much, what percentage of that is kind of that technical scientific world building?
I think it permeates everything in the sense that it's all chuffing away in the background. There's spaceship travel to get from A to B, but the primary focus is she's getting from A to B. And the same with the fact that her partner's a AI, a robot, and her spaceship is a AI that's been manipulated in a certain way so that he's got a bit of a mind of his own, and that they're all communicating with each other in a very realistic sense. same with the types of like concrete and what makes things fly and what makes things force space to move and to allow for space travel and all those sorts of bits and pieces. I try not to overload and give too much explanation. I had to cut out a lot because I wrote a lot description and had to cut it all back.
Did you find your editor suggested there was too much of that?
Yes and no. I found some of my readers, I have some readers who are just not sci-fi fans at all.
Yeah.
So they were really easy to get from that point of view and say, you lost me.
Yeah.
And I do get that a lot from quite a few of my friends. No, you lost me. I'll skip to the next bit. Oh, okay. Thanks for that. Sweet. Yeah. But so
it's not nice.
It's a balance, and you know what, I want to keep the reader going for the story and for the characters and where they're going with things. And I mean, I've got a new sci-fi one I've been working on for years and years and years that hasn't sort of gone anywhere, and that's really focused more on a whether you trust your own mind situation. And nice. I've actually got a quote from Douglas Adams, which I really like, which is everything you see or hear or experience in any way at all is specific to you. You create a universe by perceiving it. So everything in the universe you perceive is specific to you.
That's clever. I like that.
I really like that one.
Yes.
And that, I think Douglas Adams was like one of the first writers that I really hooked into as a sci-fi reader, because his stuff was fun.
Yes.
It was nonsensical, but it made sense.
Yes.
He pointed out the absurdities with how corporate world functions in a really plain and clear way, but made it fun. And I think I've taken a lot of that through with my fun sci-fi and with White Fire. There is a very specific humor that I work on very specifically with that, where it is lighter. I consider it a lighter sci-fi. So much of sci-fi is dark, and yes, sci-fi lends itself to horror aspects and to the fear of the unknown. But I think sometimes you've got to have fun with it, and I like the fun.
Douglas Adams and fun. It's kind of in the same thing. He has that incredibly British self-deprecating, poke fun at ourselves kind of things that they do so very well.
Yes, absolutely. For example, sir, I said to the universe, I exist. That, said the universe, creates no sense of obligation in me whatsoever. Which I absolutely love, because we are so little. When you really step back, we are very little in the universe. We are a tiny little ball of rock in the middle of a giant sea of nothingness. You know, it's like,
what is that inspirational quote about how we're made of so many atoms of dust, our existence is impossible? And that's the thing that I really don't like about science fiction, is that we're very rare to allow hope. You know?
There's a great series that I think at the moment is, and it was one I forgot to mention when you were talking about a great TV series, and that's The Expanse.
Oh, yes.
So written by James.
I'm gonna
wait a minute.
Little spanner in the works.
James
watches it and loves it. I know that The Expanse is actually based on a role-playing game. The guy found his mates telling him he really should be a book, and then wrote it. And I really like one of the characters. I could never get into it, and I'm just going to apologise.
Well, go and read the stories, because the stories, of course, are so much better. And I'm waiting for the Goldfields Library to really purchase book 9 of the series, please. Bendigo and Gisborne, if you would get on with that. Because I've read up to 8.
Get that book.
Yes. So just could you please buy that book? What I love about it is that in so many ways we just haven't changed, despite the fact that we have explored the universe, that we got the alien gates, and then we thought, we'll just go through them, what the heck, and then of course we'll try and shoot the aliens even though they've done nothing to us. But there is still the class system. There is still Earth is better than Mars is better than the belt, and it's just really, people, could we not learn? And then there's people who try and change, and it really was so reflective of the world as we have now, that I just saw that despite the fact that it was in space and however many hundred of years in the future, it was just a seamless segue from the current to the future, and I really liked it. So sorry, EJ, too bad, so sad.
No, to be fair,
when the last
to the series,
yeah,
to be fair to the series, I went and googled it, and I'm probably going to butcher this as well because my pronunciation sucks.
Yep.
But the politician
Avasarala.
Avasarala.
He's the best.
Avasarala, I would seriously get on bended knee and say, "You have my allegiance."
She was just amazing, and in the book, equally as amazing. Yeah.
No. And I'm sorry, I really love the actress.
Hey, can I just say, older woman protagonist?
Excuse me. Yes. I am here for it. I'm here for all of it.
Yeah,
but this is the other thing about science fiction fantasy. She indubitably proves her power.
Oh. Yes.
And I don't even need to be watching the episode. I just see a quote from her on like TikTok, and she's talking, and I'm like, I'm listening. I'm listening.
Yeah.
You have me, Queen. I am listening.
Yeah.
And I think it's because she speaks with such knowledge and prowess and whatnot, but also she's giving no shits.
No,
like I'm swearing. She is not taking any prisoners. She is not bowing down to anyone, and that's because she doesn't live in a system that believes in bowing down. She is going in there to prove a point and to make a very, very firm affirmation of her decisions and how she's come about them. And I think that this is one of the things, and I'm going to pull back a little bit to another series we were talking about earlier, Iron Widow, where
I've written that down on my list. I have to have a look at that.
Feminism in science fiction comes from women's affirmation. The idea that we can't do that science fiction works written by female authors not being picked up by agents and publishers.
We've come back around, haven't we?
Yep, we did. But the idea that they can't be picked up when so much of her portrayal just slaps, and I'm using like the slang, I don't even know whose slang it is. I'm using the slang, but so much of her power really plays through with this, and we are not capitalizing on that as writers. And part of the thing is that what she represents in the series is somebody who is so intellectually powerful, but more importantly, she knows the landscape. She can predict these fools.
Yeah. I've got a perfect quote for you that fits really nicely here. It's a quote by Aki Flinthart, who has sadly passed, but she was an Australian speculative fiction author. Her quote is, "Forget the damsel in distress. Women are strong, independent, not afraid to get their hands dirty, and more than capable of rescuing themselves and anyone else that needs it. But that doesn't mean a woman is against being swept off her feet." So I think, that's lovely. She then goes on to say that men and women are equal, meaning no one dominates or denigrates the other. And she feels that a strong woman is one who is comfortable in her own skin and knows she can stand face to face, equal with anyone, without having to tread on them to get ahead. And that is absolutely Avasarala, though I must say she does tread on a few people as she goes along. She's perhaps a little bit rougher than that.
It's only a couple.
Yeah.
Well, I've got one too to wrap into what EJ was just wrapping back as well.
Yep.
From Octavia Butler,
beautiful.
She said, and this, it just shows that things haven't changed as much as we want them to. But anyway, most of what I do is science fiction. Some of the things I do are fantasy. I don't like labels. They're marketing tools. And I certainly don't worry about them when I'm writing. They are also inhibiting factors. You wind up not getting read by certain people or not getting sold to certain people because they think they know what you write. You say science fiction and everyone thinks Star Wars and Star Trek. So it's that exact same thing where I pull this one out whenever I do a talk with anyone. It's if you've got kids' books at home, how many of them are written by a female writer with a female main character if you've only got boys at home? And the number of people that just look at me blankly and think, oh shit. Right, good point. And and it's the same with readers. You'll have readers that'll go, oh, but I don't know of any. And I'm like, well,
let me
here I
just
will give you
introduce you to a few. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to name some titles because I've got so many here, but I'm just going to name some titles. So we've got Left Hand of Darkness.
Fantastic book.
Wrinkle
Reread
of
it again.
Time,
Oh,
the fifth season, The City We Became.
Yeah, I read that
Full
one.
Moon, A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, How Rory Thorne Destroyed the Universe, The Illuminae Files, The Other Side of the Sky, Terra Nullius, as we've already mentioned, The Subjugate, Amanda Bridgman, Aussie writer, woo, love her. The City in the Middle of the Night, Charlie Jane Anders. I have to just mention that is just, you need to read Charlie Jane Anders. The Sound of Stars, Alicia Dale.
Yes, I'm here for that one. I'm sorry, it's on my list and I need to make an absolute point about
the
that
Tea
one.
Master and the Detective and the Seven of Infinities. Oh my God. Kindred, of course.
Yes.
This Is How You Lose the Time War.
Yes.
There's just so many. And those, I was just naming all the female writers just in my list. I've got a list of like 2 or 3 pages of books here of sci-fi.
So what we'll do is take your list and we'll pop it in the show notes.
Yes.
So if anybody's going, which books were they? So fear not,
absolutely,
lovely listeners, we will put
and
them
of
in the show notes.
course, I'm always going to come back to Frankenstein. Mary Shelley, she was the bomb.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to admit to having to try. I tried to read Frankenstein. Actually, no, that's not true. I tried to listen to it, but it was really hard because the language was so old. Once I kept tripping over my own feet, but it didn't quite have the rhythm of my walk around the block. So I'll perhaps have a go at it as a hard copy or as an ebook, but certainly not an audio book. So no, I'm going to admit I didn't make that one. Who, Laurie, are the writers that most influenced you, dare I ask?
So I'll always come back to Douglas Adams just because of the fun. And I read that when I was a kid.
Yes.
A lot of his stuff and even his Doctor Who stuff, which is a curse because Doctor Who was my biggest influence in all of Kingdom Come, I'm sure. I'm sure that's where a lot of my sci-fi nerdiness has come from. But certainly Douglas Adams. And really just like I initially started writing a list of authors and books that I read as a kid. And I realized that they were all middle-aged white men. I hate to say it. And they
were the people writing when we were kids.
Absolutely. And I think probably by reading those and being so annoyed by the sexism and racism in them, that's probably what got me more into wanting to write it. So
couldn't see yourself in those stories or who you wanted to be.
Precisely.
So you had to go and write them yourself.
Yep, exactly. So it is, I always say do read widely. If you're only reading a certain type of sci-fi, there is so much out there and there's so many new incredible authors, people of color and women and just all kinds of gender orientation and there are just so many different ways of thinking. And if you limit yourself to only one type of book, if you're only reading The Day of the Triffids or iRobot or exactly. I mean, and I read them as kids. War of the Worlds. I read all of these books. The Time Machine. All of these were defining.
They had their place, but there is more, and there is more out there. Absolutely. I must admit to having gone back when I got a little bit more library space in my house because my fabulous handyman husband built me a new library when one of my kids moved out. Sorry, Angus. I started to try and recollect some of the stories from my youth, like E. Doc's Lensman series and all the Asimov stuff and that. And I started to reread them and I thought, it's a bit like the whole pregnancy birth thing that we were talking about earlier. When I went back to look at it, it wasn't nearly as lovely as I had remembered. And I had to stop reading and go, okay, they have a place in my life, but perhaps not in my current library. So, EJ, your greatest influences in sci-fi?
This is always really hard for me because I always find that there's always new takes. And I always think that as much as I have loved science fiction and I want more of it in the scape that I'm reading, a lot of it is very much more modern. So I am reading The Outside by Ada Hoffman. I am reading the Sarantha Jack series by Anna Guire. I had read Anne McCaffrey's Pegasus in Flight, which came with its own deeply racist tones. But, you know, and then you talk about subgenres of science fiction. So one of the ones that I've always really loved has been steampunk. Like I love the Victorian setting, corsets and
Lindsay Buroker. Do you read Lindsay Buroker?
Lindsay Buroker's Emperor's Edge is on my list.
Fantastic.
I loved her. Like she writes some really lovely stuff. I think for me, and what I take away from the science fiction and when it comes to my own writing, is that science fiction represents an element to me of possibility that doesn't exist in the things that I am reading. And I think that's really important that we understand that as much as the building blocks of storytelling and what we do and don't tell. One of the things that was really important to me as a writer and as a reader is that there are no limitations. There is no you cannot. Fantasy in itself, and this is about fantasy as a whole, because often science fiction and fantasy go hand in hand. Fantasy represents the ability to hold it to almost medieval standards, which is kind of wrong when you think about fantasy, but it is what it is held against, as opposed to science fiction, which offers so much more possibility. And so I am inspired by more modern day things like Killjoys and like Dark Matter and like these more modern authors coming forward with these really excellent viewpoints, but also hopeful viewpoints. Like one of the things that I admire most about The Sound of Stars by Alicia Dowes is the fact that it represents a really, like, spoiler alert, a really hopeful outcome. We often represent space as being somewhat dark, and that's for two reasons. In Star Wars, we have the dark side of the Force. In Star Trek, which I'm less familiar with, I fully admit, but it does represent a sense of evil in the universe and the way that we conduct ourselves in our social environments, which then goes back to colonialism. But Alicia Dowes represents something that is much more hopeful, and we don't often allow ourselves that sense of hope in fiction because we don't have that sense of hope in our lives. Like when we talk about our politics or gun laws in America, particularly given the recent things that have happened in the last 24 hours, when we talk about what we think of the world post the pandemic or what's going to happen to the future health of the world, bearing in mind that the viruses are getting worse every day. One of the hardest things that we can actually allow ourselves to have as human beings is hope. So the idea that we can have hope in science fiction, that we can have a positive outcome, I think is one of the greatest gifts that you can actually give to a reader.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, being an aficionado of hope punk, which, you know, is that, you know, as the fabulous, I can't remember the woman's name.
I didn't know they existed, and I freaking love it. I freaking love
hope
it.
punk. So it is, in fact, was thought up by a woman, I think it was like on a Tumblr post or something, and she said it as a counter to grimdark. So works in hope punk about characters fighting for positive change, radical kindness, and communal responses to challenges. So it's not that it's wishy-washy or there's no action in it, but it's the fact that they are Alexandra Rowland, that's who it is. It's the fact that they are standing up or advocating, here we go again, for the things that for them are really important. So, yeah,
but the other thing that it does is it addresses a part of science fiction we haven't yet touched on, which is horror.
Well, yes, but we probably need,
we probably need another session.
Darren, when Darren comes back.
Yeah.
So,
but you have the Aliens film, and nobody needs to explain that. We all understand the horror of the monster in the closet, as it were. It doesn't need an explanation. When you think about science fiction, it doesn't actually have a hope punk aspect, which is one of the wonderful things about it, I think.
But it can. I think a lot of them can. Yeah.
Absolutely, it can. It just doesn't, and that's a real shame. And I think one of the really wonderful genres to actually see that in is going to be climate fiction.
Yes, yeah, which we haven't actually touched on. And also, before we jump into the cli-fi and dystopian, which we've got a couple left, and I've got a few more things, but I am looking at the time thinking, I hope
Yes.
you're not wanting to go to bed.
I
Maybe
can talk
just a couple
forever.
of minutes and we might go again. Let's make this the last kind of big question, because then I just want to jump into a little bit about publish and then let you go. So do you think science fiction's social influence is on the rise or fall, or is it kind of, somewhere in between? Because it's that balance of the new technologies, but also about the consequences of what we do to our world and the universe and or first contact. So is science fiction's social influence on the rise or fall, Laurie Bell?
Definitely on the rise. There's just more available. It's, from a diversity point of view, there is just so much more material from self-publishing and from the small publishers and the big guys and blogs and flash fiction and magazines and short stories, like anthologies. There's so much, and there is a very strong climate based, but I think there has always been the what we do to our natural world that's come through in science fiction, and I think that's only going to grow with the more fear. It's that fear of the unknown. Again, sci-fi tends to be that fear of the unknown, whether it goes in a good way or a bad way, or in the discovery of what that unknown means. And I think with climate fiction, with natural disasters, with earthquakes, all of that sort of thing, that because there's more and more that is affecting more and more people, it's only going to grow as that goes forward. And the same with the internal, with the science, with the viruses, with the nanobots, with virtual reality and Meta creating their special hologrammy world inside Facebook. And like there's so much of that internal, and then what is real and what is, where does the brain recognize what is real and what is not, and what part of that. So there's just so much with science and with the rover landing on Mars. There's so much more Mars fiction is going to appear, and it's going to be everywhere, and it's going to be terraforming and finding planets that we, as far as we don't think there's life there, but perhaps we find it, hence the sci-fi, but also what you do on those worlds and how do you survive, and it's the survival fic, and there's just more and more of that. I just see is just growing exponentially. The more people we have, the more readers we have.
Do you agree, EJ? Is science fiction social influence on the rise?
The optimist in me really wants to say yes. And I absolutely agree with Laurie there, because I absolutely think that there is so much possibility, but we are so used to being told no. We are so used to technology not being as fast as we need it to be.
We're
true. So used to being disappointed. And so
where's those flying cars?
The flying car. I don't have a flying car. But the point is that science fiction still represents a fact.
Yeah.
Science fiction based itself in fact. And every single day, the facts keep getting worse. Climate change is becoming almost irreversible. We don't know the future of the human race. And I think this is where we really need to be relying on hope punk. I think this is where we really need, for a lot of our very disillusioned millennials, of which I count myself one of, because what do you do? What do you do at the end of the day about climate change? You can vote that political party and you can recycle all your recyclable bottles. But when we're shipping it to China and they're dumping it in the ocean, what do you do? And that's not what fiction is for. Fiction is there to give us hope. So the idea of hope, the idea of being able to, and this brings us back to something that I mentioned earlier this evening, the idea that we can write, and what we write may contain a lot of very angsty emotion, but ultimately has a purpose, is where we can really start encouraging people about their own views of the future to do something, and it may be as simple as recycling, and it may be a lot more complex than that because we don't know where we're going to reach our readers. But the idea that there is hope for the future in a world where I feel that every single generation has had its own thing. Like, 40, 50 years ago, everyone was really worried about nuclear war. We had the instances with Cuba and the Americas and Russia encouraging Cuba to start nuclear war, and that's something that's pre-generational and represents.
Well, it's back again.
Yeah, it's not so much in the past, is it?
No, it represents a dystopian future that we're afraid of. But the idea that climate change is our fear is that there isn't going to be a world that we can inhabit. And so the greatest thing that we can possibly do as writers is address that and say, well, you know what? Nanobots can clean up an oil spill. Nanobots can fix what's wrong with the coral reef. We can look at doing marvelous things with high-tech filters in order to draw in carbonated air and pump out oxygen. There is an opportunity for writers to funnel so much hope, but also inspiration. One of the things that I think is wholly underutilized by the science fiction writing community is the ability to inspire. So you talk about Wells and you talk about all those old school science fiction writers and all these wonderful inventions that they came up with for the future. And what we don't talk about is their impact. So we talk about flying cars and we joke about it, yeah? What we don't talk about is a more speculative possibility of what we can do practically for our future based on the technology that we already have. And by that, I mean things like using nanobots to clean up the amount of plastic that's in the ocean and things like that, to find other ways of using plastic as building blocks. So you often see videos in third world countries where they recycle plastic and they turn it into homes. And how many people in our country actually own their own homes?
Well, it's getting more and more difficult, isn't it?
It is. And the banks are absolutely happy to continue doing so. But when we come with a much more fiscally practical method of doing it, everyone frowns upon it because it's very poor. So science fiction writers have a real opportunity here to balance out the future. But in doing so, they need to be able to understand that technology and portray it in such a way that it makes sense. I'd
have to say, EJ and Laurie, it has been amazing to chat to you for so long today, and we could go on, but I am going to call it time for this.
Probably a good idea.
Yeah, we will get you back. We will get you back. So I want to finish with asking both of you, where can people find you online? Let's start with you, EJ. Where is it best for, apart from, of course, your books on the science fiction tab of AustralianBookLovers.com, where else can people find you, EJ?
So you can find me at EJ Dawson, so that's ejdawson.com, or at EJ Dawson Author for all of my social media sites. I do encourage you to check out my website. I've written some really interesting really interesting subjects that have been on podcasts lately, particularly about the idea that a idea may not be a whole novel. So please check out my website, ejdawson.com.
Beautiful.
EJ's blog's fantastic.
I like her blog too, so there you go. And Laurie Bell, where can we find you online?
So you can find my books available on most of the usual online retail stores, and a shout out to Dimmicks Knox City in Melbourne, Dimmicks Paran and Collins 234 Collins Street Dimmicks, who have my books in their stores. Thank you very much. You are adorable and I love you. And if you'd like to hear more about me or my books, you can visit my website, which is solo-the-first, all one word, .wordpress.com. And I'm also on Twitter as at Laurie Not Laurie, Instagram and Facebook, and all those sorts of links you can find through all of those sites as well.
Excellent. Thank you. And you can, of course, as I mentioned, find Australian Book Lovers at australianbooklovers.com. We are on Twitter at Australian Books, Facebook and Instagram at Australian Book Lovers, because you can get a few more letters on there. We're also on YouTube and LinkedIn, if that's where you tend to surf social media.
And definitely go to Australian Book Lovers. There are so many wonderful books that are
So
listed.
many wonderful
So many great books. So you'll find a great read.
And they are all Australian authors, which is just fantastic. And we do have every genre under the sun. To finish up, I would like my panellists to get ready to say the tagline. And just in case you don't remember, the tagline is, remember to read more Aussie books. And we'll get our fabulous editor, Darren, to, because he's unfortunately missed out on being a part of this panel, he'll have to make something spacey in there.
Yeah,
So,
I expect space puns, and if he doesn't deliver, I'm going to kill him in my next novel.
yes, kill him off in the next novel.
Robots.
Yeah.
Darren,
right.
robots. I want robots.
I'm going to leave you with one little quote from Ray Bradbury, who wrote, amongst many things, the book Fahrenheit 451, which is the temperature at which paper burns, which was it's a dystopian future, but, pretty tragic. However, this quote I love. One of his characters says, "Stuff your eyes with wonder," he said. "Live as if you drop dead in 10 seconds. See the world. It's more fantastic than any dream made or paid for in factories." So with that in mind, in case you drop dead in 10 seconds, please go out and get yourself a fabulous science fiction book. We'll have the lists from these wonderful panelists in the show notes, and I might just add a few of my own in there. And what do we have to tell our listeners is to remember to...
read more Aussie books.
I didn't know that was going to be a test at the end.
Oh, no. Do we have to do it again? Are you ready now? That was your practice.
Right.
Let's do it one more time. Okay. So, listeners, remember to...
read more Aussie books.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, and take care, everyone.
Thank you, Veronica.
See you on the next episode.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Let's meet again. Where magic happens.
Australian Book Lovers acknowledges First Nations peoples and recognises their continuous connection to country, community and to culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and honour the sharing of traditional stories passed down through generations. We're committed to a safe and inclusive welcome for authors and readers of all cultures and backgrounds, including people of LGBTQIA+ communities and their families.